Man, it's good to see your face. How you doing?
Good, good. How about you?
Good. Really good. We got a little rain this morning and we really needed it. So
Oh,
nice.
yeah, we're recovering from a severe thunderstorm. It was much worse to the north of the city, but we made it.
Yeah, I think you guys get a lot more weather than we do.
Well, it's a lot. Yeah, it's going to be 95 today. So
Oh, and humid because of that
yeah,
storm, I'm sure.
yes, yes.
Well, thank you. I know you know that Franny, we had a good conversation with Franny a couple weeks ago.
Hmm.
And I must have miscommunicated because she thought both of you were coming on last Monday, but I already had another guest. And then I was so thrilled that when she said that she couldn't make it, but you were still willing to. So thank you.
You're welcome.
So let's just start with you. Well, let me just give you kind of the lowdown. We are obviously on Zoom. This is also live on Facebook and going to my YouTube channel. So
Okay,
just so you know,
okay.
audience typically is somewhere between 20 and 30. And I don't know why, but they're often very shy. So we don't get a lot of questions. You and I just kind of chat.
Okay.
So just introduce yourself and tell everybody where you're from. So if they have business to send, they can.
Okay. My name's Hubert Beattie. I'm a member of the Urban Cool real estate team that we have here at Keller Williams Key Partners here in Kansas City, Missouri. I've been in real estate, 14 years. So it's something I've always enjoyed, even when I was doing other jobs. And so I really enjoy doing the work. I enjoy the people, the atmosphere. Um, I can't think of anything else. I wish I'd have done it sooner in my life, but sometimes it's better later than sooner.
What'd you do before real estate, Hubert?
I worked, my very first job out of college was in law enforcement. So I was a police officer for about 4 years. And then I moved into federal corrections. So I've seen actually both sides of the law enforcement field, which is kind of tied into, what's going on right now and the streets of the city, of most major cities in this country. So I can relate to it personally.
Okay, so let's just dive in there, because that is a very unique perspective, right?
Uh-huh. Right.
And so that was a while ago. I always want to say, because I have 4 years law enforcement experience too, but it was in the early 90s, so
Yeah.
might be somewhat different now, right? But
Right.
maybe
Right.
not.
Mine was my career started in the early 80s. So and then it ended in the early 2000s. So
Okay, so from being a black man on the street as a street cop, what was that
mhm.
experience like? And was that also Kansas City?
No, I'm from St. Joe, Missouri originally, which is about 50 miles north of Kansas City. So it's a small industrial town, about 75,000 people. And so that's where I grew up. And went to high school, college, and then as a police officer, I probably knew directly or indirectly 30% of the people I came in contact with.
Okay.
So that added a little bit of stress sometimes in terms of domestic disturbances and those kind of things, because some of these people I went to high school with, or I, knew their parents, or, there was all sorts of interrelationships going on there in
Sure.
terms of being law enforcement. So.
And is St. Joe diverse, or is it pretty white? What I would
Yeah,
consider
yeah,
Missouri
it
probably
is.
is all pretty white, right?
Yeah, so the Black population made up probably about 1% of the city,
Oh, whoa. Okay.
or maybe a
So
little more, probably 2%.
either
So
of those numbers is very low.
yes.
So what was your experience? How was that influenced? How was your race influencing your experience as a cop?
Well, I was an athlete in high school, pretty good, and then I went on and and played sports in college. So a lot of people knew who I was just from that exposure. So there were some, I guess, there were some benefits to that in some respects. I think at times it also was a disadvantage as well.
So that kind of a little bit of celebrity status.
A little bit. I hate to say that word.
I said it. You don't have to say it.
Yeah, I mean,
you can't.
you know,
everybody
like,
knows you, so you
right.
can't.
So
I mean, it brings extra scrutiny.
And the trust factor, I probably had a little more than maybe if I hadn't been in sports and a local celebrity star kind of thing.
Okay.
So
Val asked, did knowing people who got in trouble change how you handled them?
at times, you know, one of the biggest was a close friend of my dad's, and he came over all the time when we were growing up. Well, he was pulled over for a DUI, and no, he wasn't pulled over. He was actually off the side of the road sleeping in his car, very similar to what happened in where was that? Minnesota? No, it wasn't. Yeah, Atlanta. There's so many I can't keep track, but and so basically the other officer was going to arrest him, and he wasn't driving, but he was still behind the wheel, so theoretically he could. And I kind of intervened and said, hey, if I call you a cab, is that okay? Will you pay for it? He said, fine. Called him a cab took him home, and he come back and got his vehicle the next day. So it was one of those situations that, you know, if he'd been driving or he had an accident, killed somebody, hurt himself, tore up a lot of property, then yeah, we would have had to go through with it. But he was just sitting in his vehicle, sleeping it off. Somebody called in, and we were able to handle it without being arrested, without arresting him.
Yeah.
So.
And that could be advantage of a small town. And again, back in those years.
Yes.
Yeah. Might be handled differently now. So when you I didn't realize you had the corrections background too. So when you went into corrections, what was that like? Well,
it was different in a sense that first they took your weapons away. So you didn't have any weapons. And you know, I only worked the custody side, which is when I first entered, for about 4 years. Then I bounced around from various jobs inside the institution. So it's basically like a city within a city. You had doctors, nurses, attorneys, case managers, psychology was big, education. And I think that when I first started, the government, believe it or not, invested a lot of time in inmate development and money. And through the years, that sort of reduced. And the return rate also went up when they stopped doing that. For example, at Leavenworth, inmates could get an associate's degree. They had teachers coming in, instructors coming in from the local universities, a couple junior colleges, at the University of Kansas. They had one coming where I went to school, Missouri Western. So the inmates could get Pell Grants and finance their education. And what some of the case managers were telling me, because in an indirect way, I kind of like to keep track of that just for my own personal guidance. And they would say that, you know, the better educated they were, or the better educated they worked on themselves, the less likely they would come back.
And what was the recidivism rate? Do you know?
I really don't. It's been years. I think the last time I checked was 1999 when I was, so I have no idea what it was. They just said that the ones that walked out with an associate's or a 4-year degree were less likely to return, even
Which
though
makes sense.
Which makes sense, yes.
Yeah. So just a couple weekends ago, I watched 13th, which is a very hard watch, and I'm glad I watched it. And that is all about the mass incarceration.
Mhm.
Have you seen it?
No.
Maybe we can talk about it if you watch it, because it goes into what a big industrial complex it really is,
Mhm.
especially now because a lot of the privatization and the free labor that they've gotten for decades out of the prisons, virtually free labor.
Right.
Was that part? Did you experience that too?
Yes, there were, we had several, we had factories actually at the institution. They made furniture for government contracts. They were protected. As I left, they were getting less and less contracts. A lot of corporations were fussing to the government and senators and congressmen about how they were losing out. But actually Unicor, which was the business side of the Bureau of Prisons, was started by Eleanor Roosevelt. That was one of her projects back in the 40s. So there seems to be conflict now with private companies as far as wanting to get those contracts that the government's been protecting for inmates for years. There are other companies that work within the Bureau of Prisons themselves. Honeywell was one of the largest. They weren't at our location, but they were at other locations. And there were several large corporations that would send people in to actually supervise the inmates working.
Interesting. I had no idea any of that happened.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, let's shift gear.
Okay.
Franny, and I think you're open to taking questions. So if
Mhm.
anybody has questions around that, we can always put them in the chat box or chime in.
Okay.
When Franny and I talked, obviously we talked a lot about the community and your experiences there, both in real estate and then just as a biracial couple.
Right.
One thing she had mentioned is that you brought it to her attention that as you're doing a lot of the calls, if you know the person on the other side of the phone is white and they assume you're white, you hand it off. You don't even waste your time because you know that if you were to go and show up on that appointment, you would be what's the word?
Judged.
Judged. Yeah. Oh, I was thinking more you would be wasting your time is where my brain went.
Yeah.
But yeah, so go there. You would be judged. What is
well, that? And this early in my real estate career, I needed to get a boost very quickly. So I was doing expireds and FSBOs for sale by owners. And so the conversation on the phone was really good. And so when we would set an appointment to meet, then it would just go south very quickly. And either I wouldn't hear from them again, or they wouldn't answer, or, you know,
did
they
you
went
see
with,
it when you say went south quickly? When you showed up, did you see?
yeah, I
surprise?
could, there were times, I mean, most of the time they were still very nice and we sit down and talk, but I could just get a sense that this probably isn't going anywhere.
Interesting.
So, you know, it's just one of those things that happen. But when I was meeting people that were people of color, the whole situation changed. In
People of color of any color or specifically in the Black community?
Black and Hispanics as well. Certainly, a lot of times I could close it on that meeting. And so it didn't take long to realize that I was going to have to navigate real estate a little differently.
Okay.
And I thought with a lot of the connections I had with the Bureau of Prisons and some of the other connections I had with white people that would give me the advantage, but it didn't.
Okay. And that's interesting. So even though you had those pre-existing relationships in a very fraternal, I mean, you know, within law enforcement,
Yeah.
everybody pretty much sticks tight.
Right.
It didn't translate. When
No.
in probably going to be a silly question, but why do you think that is?
Yeah, well, I think probably race had a big part to do with it. A lot of times too, I found that people that I wouldn't say real close, but close enough, are not always comfortable with disclosing, financial information, things like that. They want to keep that personal. So it might be better to work with somebody I don't know versus somebody that knows a lot about me.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes
I think sometimes we do see that. Yeah.
So I think not everyone wasn't hung up on the race issue. It was, I think sometimes they just wanted to keep certain parts of their life separate from friends.
Okay.
So.
All right. Val, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just when Franny brought that up, I was just like really pissed off, to be honest with you, that because that you were going through that. And I reached out to a biracial couple we have in my office who are a good producing, they're ALC quality agents. And I reached out to him and I said, do you go through that? And here we are in the San Francisco Bay Area. And he was like, oh yeah. He goes, when I get to a point where I realize I'm not going to be able to close it, I hand it off my wife so she can close it.
Yeah, it's, most people don't really mind us working together. It's just that the point person. And, there are times when they've actually called me and said, oh, well, we'll go ahead and use you. And I go, oh.
Get a little surprise every once in a while. So what, I guess, tell us some of your best and worst experiences that have to do with race within real estate.
There's not been an overly bad experience. I think one time early before we actually started using a professional photographer, I was kind of doing my own. I'm pretty good with the camera. I'm certainly not a professional, but not too bad. And so I was taking pictures of a house. Actually, it was a woman that I went to high school with that moved here to Kansas City. And she knew I sold real estate, so she actually called me and wanted me to help her get her house sold. So I'm taking photos of the house and the exterior. And a guy comes across the street, neighbor, and says, do they know you're taking pictures of this house? And kind of a stern voice. And I said, yes, they do. And he said, so who are you? And at first I thought, well, no, first I said, just leave me alone. I'm in the street, I'm busy. And then he asked again. And I thought, well, okay, if I give him one of my cards, he'll go away. So I just reached my pocket and said, they're selling their house. Here's my card. I'm handling the sale. If you know anybody, let me know. And then I asked him why he was there. I said, you thinking about selling? He was, and he just kind of looked at me and walked away. And that was about it. That's probably the only experience I've had where I've actually been challenged by someone inquiring. But I'm always very careful.
What does that mean?
Well, it means one time I set the alarm off and the house was vacant. I knew it was, but I had to code, but for some reason the alarm went off.
I think we've all done that.
Yes, but I'm okay. I thought, okay, I know they're going to show up here in 5 minutes, 10. And so I was just prepared for, I could be treated like a criminal.
Yeah.
And so I stood on the front porch just waiting and trying to be as harmless looking as I possibly could for them to show up. And they actually were pretty cool about it. So.
And yet that still crossed your mind.
Oh yeah, and it crossed my mind anytime I'm not so much showing a house, But a lot of times when we list houses, especially ones that are vacant, that I'm very careful about, especially if I'm there at night. I'm not so much worried about being robbed or anything like that. I'm worried more about somebody mistaking me for a burglar or something.
It's really interesting because I know for me, when we would go, my partner and I would go to a vacant house after dark for whatever reason, we had concerns, but it was, oh, are we safe? You know, is somebody, oh, we always talk about keep yourself between the door
Right.
and whoever you have in there. You're looking at this in a different way.
Right, a completely different. I'm worried more about the police, you know, being misunderstood in some way or another. And even though I do have experience, lots of experience, in how to even address that issue, but I still worry about that one more than anything else.
And have you had a negative experience with the police at all, ever?
Ever? Yes, not to the point where it had gone physical. One time when I was in corrections, I was on what is called a travel crew. So we were shuttling inmates from various states. We like going, our route was Colorado. So we would go to Florence, Colorado, which is, I would say maybe 75, 80 miles south of Denver, small little town. And the complex they built was relatively new. So we were on our way back, but from Colorado. So we're on I-70. No, we were in Oklahoma. We were coming from, that's right, we were coming from Oklahoma. So we were coming up 35.
These are all very white places.
Yeah.
That's why I'm laughing.
So we didn't, buses didn't have to stop at the weight scales. Federal buses didn't have to stop. And so we didn't stop. And a deputy was sitting just off the side of the road, just north of the weight scale, and he pulls us over for not stopping. And so we're trying to explain to him that we didn't have to stop. And the supervisor happened to be Black. I was driving, I was Black, and it was a 3-man crew. So the officer in the back was Black too. And he didn't get out, but the deputy sees two Black men with guns. Well, we have ID and everything, and he wanted to board the bus. And it turned into a real conflict. We resolved it, but we were sitting on the side of the highway longer than we needed to be.
And did you have people on the bus besides that?
Yes, we had I think 35, 36 on board. And
wow.
The way we were trained, nobody was only the people that worked the bus are supposed to be on the bus. And this deputy didn't want to accept that. I'm thinking race had an issue with it. We finally, like I said, got it resolved, but it took 40 minutes.
Wow. Okay. So what have you and Franny, if anything, experienced as an interracial couple in a place that probably doesn't see a whole lot of that?
Well, I mean, you know, the thing is, in Kansas City and St. Louis, I always call it 2 patches of blue in the middle of red. But but as far as real estate goes, we probably had a few little, maybe they didn't go with us simply because of that, but nothing really that stands out. Franny and I was talking just yesterday that some people don't want to live east of the racial divide that was in Kansas City from the beginning, truce. And it's slowly changing, but I think she was working with someone that flat out didn't want to live close to it or east of truce. And so that was difficult for her. I said, well, they all have a shooting over there on an occasion and nobody wants to live around that. And I said, I've had Black people tell me, the first thing out of their mouths is, I don't want to live east of truce. And so what do you say about that? But as far as anybody just singling us out, being just downright disrespectful. I've not had that experience.
And my guess is just because it's 2020, most of the racial prejudice is a lot more subtle. I think a lot of people have gotten better at hiding it.
Yeah, you know, I can still, you know, you can still sense it, even though most people really, but as far as blatant every day, you know, I think I had a guy snatch a, before the corona got bad, it was last fall. I was doing an open house, I had a listing, and the gentleman snatched the house information out of my hand. And I responded, well, are we having a bad day today? And he kind of shuffled around that. So the next piece of information that I had in regards to us, as he reached for it, I dropped it. I couldn't help myself. And so he said, are we having a bad day? I said, yeah, we are having one when you stepped in the door. And so anyway, he kind of walked around, him and his daughter, and walked out. I think she was giving it to him as they were headed to the car, but that's probably the worst experience I've had.
Okay.
So
So as all these, the tension that has flared up, and I know it has there too, and conversations that I don't know that they were intentionally avoided, but I think a lot of us had thought the majority of the country had progressed a lot further than it really has.
yes.
When I was thinking about you this weekend, I thought, all right, he's a safe guy to ask. What are some things that white people do that you'd like us to stop doing, or questions we ask, or assumptions we make? What, from your perspective as a Black man, help me get better?
I think listening is probably the best thing you can do.
Okay, your camera is zooming way.
Yeah, it's.
You got great teeth.
Yeah, I don't use it normally. As I move, sometimes it moves, so I'll try to stay still. I think listening is probably the best thing. Most people of color it's going to take a while for them to trust you. And it's going to take a while for them to trust you to open up to something so deep. Years ago, I went to what they call Afraid of the Dark class. It was a book titled that. It was taught by an instructor at UMKC. And it was probably 60% Black and 40% white. And for me, it was a real refreshing experience as far as being able to put it out there and then listening to their responses as well, and them talking. When it ended, I was really kind of sorry. I wanted to do it again, go over the same material, but it basically they just sit and listen. Some people were really upset with all parts of it, you know, just everything that has happened. And that was years ago. I mean, it's much more intense right now.
Yeah.
But I think listening is the key. If you can find someone that you're halfway comfortable with, and maybe ask a few questions, and just wait for a response. It may take a while before they really feel comfortable sharing, because we're conditioned not to share that amongst people that are white. Only people that are.
Why do you think that is?
Well, our whole society is based on, you know, Black suppression. From everything from the movies we watch to commercials. So everything. So therefore, you know, my parents told me to never trust anybody white. And then when you start seeing those things personally, that white people are handled differently and you're not, and it's just the subtle things, from school to elementary school to high school to college. You know, I played sports for 3 years. Injury, I had a lot of injuries. So my 4th year, I decided I was done with this. And so I took out a loan to finish my last year. And a lot of students came up to me that I'd known for years, were surprised that I was still going, that I wanted to finish, that it wasn't just basketball.
Because the
So,
assumption is
that's all I was
black
there
kids only go to college for sports.
for sports, yeah.
Wow.
So anyway, so yeah, my suggestion is listen. But our entire society is based on that. So it's hard to undo all that after, I always joke with Franny, that it's hard to undo 400 years.
Well, I totally agree. And even harder when, honestly, in the last month, I've become so much more aware of things I should have been aware of, just historical context that, you know, we've all been lied to throughout school intentionally. And if we don't, as a group, as a collective, as a country, understand what really has gone on, you can't undo it.
Right.
So the people saying we just need to move forward, yes, and without understanding where we came from and what we perpetrated, we can't change much.
Right. I mean, I remember history class in high school. We all had to take American history, and they skipped over. They talked about slavery for a minute, and then they went to the Civil War, and then they didn't talk about Jim Crow at all, and we're into the 50s. And so when I went to college, it was the same thing. You had 6 hours of American history. Most universities require that. And the instructor, when we got to slavery, he said, if you want to learn about slavery and that sort of thing, you have to take Black history. And so we had a whole section on slavery in the book, and he skipped that entire section, went to the Civil War briefly, and then we were done with that part of it. We never really talked about, or even.
And were you cognizant, being a student, like were you cognizant of the intentionality around that?
Yeah, yes, I was, because I'm in the middle of 8 children. So my older siblings, the 2 oldest, were 13, 14 years older than I.
Oh,
so
wow.
they were the first to integrate into elementary, or they were the first to integrate into high school after Brown versus Topeka decision. So they had a different perspective on school than I did. It changed from the time I actually got there, but they were the first group. So I was seeing at an early age that kind of thing that was going on in a small town of St. Joe. So, yeah. You know,
what did they experience? That had to be, I haven't spoken to anybody who was in that first wave of integration in school. What was that, from what you experienced or what they've shared with you, what was that experience like for them?
Well, it was very hard. You know, my older brother, he was a pretty good athlete himself, but the coach said simply, if you're Black, you're never going to play for me. So he wound up going to the private Catholic school across town, simply because they were trying to build a program, and they really didn't care what color you were. So anyway, but I think the hardest thing for him and my dad alike, that he went to Vietnam, and then he comes back, and some of his friends that were, you know, from all over the country, but 3 of them from the South, they couldn't vote because that was before the Voting Rights Act.
They could go fight in Vietnam, but couldn't vote.
Couldn't vote. So, you know, just a real hard time with that. And so I probably learned more than most children. Simply, my sister actually went to the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech in DC. She was living there at the time. And so, you know, I got to hear about her experience firsthand as I got older, but certainly used to hear her and my older brother talk to my parents. I guess I shouldn't have been listening, but I couldn't help myself. So I sort of, you know, lived it and experienced it and saw it from through their eyes as well.
So now, because we are opening, you know,
Mhm.
these conversations everywhere, and hopefully more and more and more, what do you think we need to be focused on or talking about? What voices do we need to invite? I got interesting feedback last week on a different, this same time, but a call that was just kind of our agents. And the opinion was brought up that we should probably bring a conservative voice on also. And I went, that's interesting. I feel like that's all we get to hear most of the time. Yet I'm open to that. And again, from where you sit with your background, what would be the most useful conversations we should enter so that we can listen?
Oh, bringing someone conservative?
Yeah.
Um,
Zooming again.
yeah. Yeah, you know, there are a few of my, I wouldn't necessarily, our friendship's been strained, but there were a couple of people that I was fairly close to that have an extremely conservative view. And they constantly share with me that it's not about race. And
That
I,
seems so odd to me. I don't know these
yeah,
people, but
it-
I think that is so presumptuous as a white person to, well, are they white? I made that assumption.
yes, yes,
To say that to somebody with any different color in their skin.
yeah.
I don't understand that one.
Well, I don't understand it either because two of the three are union presidents.
Oh, wow.
And you know, unions aren't supported by Republicans at all. And I tell them that. I said, so you vote Republican all the time. And that's okay, but how can you go back to your union members when all the union money is going to Democratic candidates?
Yeah.
I mean, they go to DC to talk to candidates and senators and congressmen. They do it every year for a week. And I said, so do you vote? Do you talk to any Republicans? And he said, no. But I said, but you vote Republican.
Well, and I would also think, I don't have any numbers to substantiate this, but I would think that most unions have a much more diverse membership base.
Sometimes it depends on what shop you're in, but
Right.
yeah.
So if you're a union president, you're leading a diverse base, how
Yeah.
to believe racism isn't an issue?
Well, that's what, you know, I got every excuse why he votes Republican other than the truth. You can't tell me the truth.
Yeah.
And I said, it's okay to, you know, the first step to healing is being honest. And, you know, he looks at me all crazy. I said, okay, you don't believe me. Well, no, I don't believe you. I don't.
The first step is actually being aware. And I think that's where the blind spot is. So we've got the
Yeah.
awareness and then the honesty, and the lack of awareness is.
Well, he's aware that he's racist, but he can't really tell me that.
Okay.
So, you know, some people don't realize that he realizes it.
He does realize it.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. But he still wants to be friends with me. I don't understand that either.
I gotta say, you've got such an incredibly warm energy about you. The first time you walked into the office, you calm a room. So that doesn't surprise me at all. And with that, how do you remain calm? Are there times that you get triggered and you just want to go, well, you freaking idiot?
Yeah, there are times I'm probably not as aggressive about that as I was early and when I was younger. It just depends on the intensity of it. If it's something subtle, then I just kind of bring it up subtly and then move on. But if it's something like in my face, then I'll react to that much quicker. But it is most of the time it's subtle, very subtle, or really subtle. I think the only time I really got upset was I was at a Hallmark shop and buying a card, and the woman asked me for ID. I was paying with a bank card.
Oh boy.
And so she was asking everybody in front of me, but anyway, and so I went ahead and did it. And then there was a police officer behind me that said, oh, she's doing her job. And so I turned around and I said, no, she's not doing her job until she asks you for ID. And I'm going to stand here and make sure she does. And then, so he walks up, I'm still standing there because the manager knows where this is going if she doesn't. And so anyway, we exchanged words as we were walking out the door together. And I thought, wait a minute, he's a policeman, I could get arrested. Maybe I should just keep my mouth shut. But anyway, yeah.
So at the Hallmark store, do you see yourself represented in cards? I mean, you opened up by saying, all the media messages are obviously suppressing.
Not all. Now, it depends on where you are in the community. This was in Johnson County in Kansas. So I would say the Black population there is maybe 3 or 4%. You come over to Kansas City, Missouri, where the Black population is roughly 18, 19, maybe 20. So if you go into a Hallmark shop in downtown Kansas City, they're going to have sections of cards, especially for people of color, more diverse customers. And the same with grocery store, Price Chopper down here where I live, Southern Kansas City, you don't see a lot of different types of food they carry with different ethnicities. But you go to the Price Chopper in the Northeast part of the city where you have lots of Asians, people from India, people straight from Africa, and a lot of Hispanics. I was in there last week and I was really surprised by what the foods they carry that you wouldn't find in any other Price Chopper throughout the city. Yeah. Because of their customers. So they're
at least catering to their demographic.
Right. So it just depends on what part of town you're in.
I appreciate that perspective because I just have this assumption that there's really not a whole lot of diversity anywhere in Missouri.
Yeah, I mean, I know from being from the coast, it's a little different, but yeah, I mean, Kansas City is fairly diverse, but again, they're kind of restricted to the east part of the city, and the income is a lot lower there than other parts. I didn't necessarily grow up with segregation in St. Joe because there wasn't that many of us as a whole, so we were sprinkled out all over town.
How did your parents land there?
I asked my mother that how, and it was actually my grandfather. His brother lived here in Kansas City, but at the time of his era, we had 4 main packing houses in one city. So that 90% of the Black men in St. Joe worked there. My father was a mechanic, automobile mechanic, so he didn't work the packing houses. So he repaired cars for a shop. And the guy that owned the dealership was Jewish. So
interesting.
Yeah.
So how did you decide to go into law enforcement at that time in history? That seems like
the last thing I would want to do.
An odd choice.
Yeah, I came out of a small Midwestern university, which was probably mistake number 1, and number 2, as I started applying for jobs throughout the country, being from a small Midwestern university that nobody heard of limited my chances, and so I needed to eat.
What was your degree in, Hubert?
Business administration. And I decided, well, I just took the test, didn't think I was going they didn't think they were going to hire me, and the rest is history.
Interesting.
Yeah, but I like the you didn't really work in the office. I certainly like the interactions with people, and really that's probably the common thread that law enforcement and real estate have.
Yeah. Definitely, you get the people interaction, just different different aspects of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So then when you got into real estate, how did you make that choice? Because that's also, you're not thinking I'm a Black man going into a very predominantly white
Oh, but
career.
I was.
You were?
Yes.
Okay.
That was kind of, I knew that I was going to have to do it differently. I didn't know how, but I'd always been attracted to real estate. I was, even when I was on the department, I would watch the real estate market just in the paper, Wall Street Journal, things like that. I had a couple of people that were agents. You know, I bought property very early, very young in life. And so I always had a thing for it. In the back of my mind, I thought that this was something I wanted to do. But again, I knew it was 100% commission. You had to get out of the gate early to eat, and you know, get married, 3 kids. It was going to be hard to make that transition. So the government 20-year retirement, you can get out, and benefits and so on, healthcare, and so it's still young enough to transition into real estate. And so I actually had my license in transitioning about 8 years before I actually retired.
So, and I didn't know this question didn't come to me just now, but as an owner of a brokerage and a former team leader, obviously doing recruiting, when you first got in, what was your experience like finding an office that you felt comfortable in and that would welcome you in?
Well, I'm not sure about California, but here you come up on a list, and they start contacting you. It's like expired listings. So as soon as you pass the test, all the brokers have your name and your phone number, and address. So they're sending you letters and come in for an interview and so on and so on. And so actually, my first interview was with a Keller Williams office. But the thing, at least here, the schools don't prepare you for what office to go to. They did talk about it a little bit, like, you know, go to 4 or 5 before you make a decision. And actually, I went to a Coldwell Banker because they do a lot of relocation. And I was trying to get into that relocation market because with the Bureau of Prisons, they did a lot of relocation too. And that's what I wanted to get into. I thought that would be my niche in this. But
Never mind the 45% referral fees.
But it didn't quite work out that way. There were a couple of agents in Leavenworth, and they did the Bureau and the military, and that's all they did. But that market has now changed a lot. So I don't know how they're making it.
How big is Leavenworth? I forgot that that's there. When you said that earlier, I thought,
yeah,
isn't that one of the largest prisons in the country?
It used to be. It's the oldest. Actually, they broke ground on that in 1895.
Oh my goodness.
And so some of your most famous, notorious gangsters of the 20s, the 30s, and 40s passed through those doors. But the city itself is about 35,000 people. So it's not very big, but the military base is there, and then the institution sits right next to it. So it's a military prison town. You take those 2 elements away, and the city wouldn't exist.
Probably not a place I'd want to hang out.
It's not bad. It's a lot of history.
Yeah, yeah. Visit maybe. Yeah. So Hubert, what wisdom do you have for us, and then also what can we do for you?
Wisdom would be probably to listen and maybe go back and take a second look at history. By doing that, I think it will give most people a perspective as to why we're where we're at.
So this is going to sound like an odd question, but I've just stumbled onto some things. Do you have any specific resources? Because so many of our history books are completely whitewashed.
Yeah, I mean, the internet is a good place. I mean, for example, Franny and I are doing a show on diversity and race and
that's Friday mornings, right?
Yes, but we had to slow it down because we're still trying to get material together to have a basis. But as I was doing a little of my research, just tying race and real estate together, R&R, you know, the federal government passed a lot of laws in the 30s regarding to keeping races segregated.
Yeah.
The federal government played a big role in that in the 30s and 40s. And then, you know, as the Supreme Court started changing the law, and then the government changed back in the 60s and in late 60s. 68 was probably a couple of the big decisions, but one of them in the 30s, an agent could lose their license if they sold to Black people in a white community. Now you can lose your license if you do it the other way.
Well, and it's only taken how many years, but.
So, you know, yes, our government, and that's probably where we're going to lead is how the government has.
Oh. Hubert, I don't know if it paused for everybody, but you froze, sir. Well, hopefully he comes back. Robert, thank you for that. What is 1619 Project? Is that a book? Is it a film?
It actually is a 100-page document from the New York Times that was started to re-examine the legacy of slavery in the United States.
Okay.
Over its 400-year history.
Okay. Thank you.
And the whitewashing that we've done with our history books.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't learn that in regular history books.
No, it's really fascinating. Anyway, I know we have shared as a group. I don't know if he'll be able to come back on today, Hubert, but I'd love to have him back as often as he's willing to, as he and Franny, I guess, build out their curriculum for their calls. Has anybody else read anything recently or seen a good documentary that we haven't yet talked about?
I'm attempting to watch the Netflix one, you guys, the 13th. What is it? Yeah, I don't know if my stomach's ready for that yet.
Good call.
Suck it up. Suck it up. It's really good to watch. I watched a documentary recently with Angela Davis and Jane Elliott, who was the professor who did the experiment with blue eyes versus brown eyes and intelligence following the assassination of Martin Luther King. And it was so amazing to hear these very powerful women speaking. And the interview came out in 2018. I would encourage anybody who hasn't heard that to listen to that. You can see that on YouTube. Really powerful.
And thank you for bringing that up. I was not really aware of Angela Davis until 13th. And man, she's now one of my absolute heroes and will be a mentor. She's amazing.
Well, if you grew up in the Bay Area, you saw a lot of Angela Davis back in the day. And she taught at San Francisco State before she went to Santa Cruz. So she was very big up here. What I was going to say is The Color of Law. I don't think I've heard you guys talk about The Color of Law. And that's a book by Robert Rothstein. He's a UC Berkeley professor, and he basically chronicles the history of how the government, Fannie Mae, FHA, and the city governments and the National Association of Realtors created segregation in this country. And it's brutal. It will infuriate you, but it's a history book. And we're doing it in our office as a book club starting next month.
Awesome. Thanks, Val. All right, y'all.
I also think season 1 and 2 on Pose. It's lighthearted, but it shows the Black transgender community in New York ballroom scene in the late 80s and 90s. And it starts in the 80s where the AIDS pandemic hit, but it shows a different side of the gay community, how there's even racism within the gay community.
Oh, for sure. For sure. All right, kids. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. We'll see you Wednesday back with Emmerich. Have a great week and learn something.